The lantern light appeared inside the barn during the blizzard, though no footprints led from Boone Halleck's cabin across the snow-buried yard. His neighbors watched from their frost-covered windows, wondering how a man could move through a winter storm without leaving a single track in the drifts that had trapped everyone else inside for 2 days. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. Boone Halleck descended the wooden steps built into the earthen floor beneath his sleeping platform. The air grew cooler as he moved downward, carrying his lantern in one hand and an empty grain sack in the other. The tunnel entrance was narrow, just wide enough for a man carrying supplies to pass through without turning sideways. He had built it that way deliberately. Wider would have required more excavation, more stone, more structural support. This width was sufficient for his purposes. The tunnel stretched 42 feet from his cabin to his barn. Boone had measured it precisely during construction, marking the distance with stakes before he ever broke ground. The passage was tall enough that he could walk upright without stooping, though his hat brim occasionally brushed the stone arch overhead. The walls were lined with field stones fitted together with the care of a stonemason, though Boone had never trained in that trade. He had learned by doing, by studying how stones locked together, by understanding which shapes would bear weight and which would shift under pressure. His boots made soft sounds against the packed earth floor as he walked. The tunnel was dry despite the blizzard raging above ground. He had engineered a slight downward grade from the cabin end toward the barn, allowing any moisture that did seep through the stones to drain away from his living quarters. The gradient was barely perceptible when walking, perhaps 2 inches over the tunnel's full length, but it was enough to keep water moving in the right direction. The lantern light played across the stone arch overhead. Each stone in that arch was load-bearing, pressed tight against its neighbors by the weight of the earth above. Boone had constructed the arch without mortar, knowing that mortar would crack in the freezing and thawing cycles of Dakota Territory winters. Dry stacked stone, properly fitted, would flex slightly with temperature changes and ground movement without failing. The technique was old, used in root cellars and mine shafts, but Boone had adapted it for a purpose no one else had considered. He reached the barn end of the tunnel and climbed the stone steps he had built into the wall. The exit was positioned in the corner of his barn, integrated into the foundation so seamlessly that someone unfamiliar with the structure might not immediately recognize it as an entrance. Boone pushed open the wooden hatch above his head and emerged into the barn's interior. The temperature was warmer here than outside, but cooler than his cabin. His 3 cows shifted in their stalls, recognizing his presence. He moved to the grain storage area where wooden bins held oats, corn, and wheat he had harvested the previous autumn. The grain was dry, the bins showing no signs of moisture damage or mold. Above him, wind screamed across the barn's roof, driving snow into drifts that were burying fence posts and blocking the barn's main door from the outside. Boone filled his grain sack, tied it closed, and returned to the tunnel entrance. The previous winter had taught Boone Halleck about failure. February of 1842 brought a warm spell that melted the heavy snows accumulated since November. For 3 days, temperatures rose above freezing during daylight hours, turning the Dakota Territory landscape into a maze of running water and saturated ground. The melt soaked through everything. Snow that had been piled against buildings turned to slush, then to rivulets that found every crack and gap in frontier construction. Boone's barn had seemed solid enough when he built it the summer before. Log construction with a stone foundation, chinked walls, and a shake roof that shed rain effectively during autumn storms. But the winter melt revealed weaknesses he had not anticipated. Water from melting snow pooled against the foundation stones, found gaps in the mortar, and seeped through into the barn's interior. The dirt floor became mud. Moisture wicked up into the wooden grain bins he had constructed along the walls. He discovered the damage on the 4th day of the thaw. The oats he had stored in the largest bin showed signs of moisture penetration along the bottom boards. The grain nearest the floor was wet, beginning to sour with the smell of early spoilage. Boone spent that day shoveling grain from the bin, spreading the wet portions on canvas to dry, trying to salvage what he could. He lost nearly 40 pounds of oats to mold. The corn fared better because he had stored it in smaller quantities in raised barrels, but even those showed moisture condensation on their interior surfaces. His neighbor, Hiram Pogue, lost more. Hiram's barn sat lower in the drainage, and his grain storage system relied on cloth sacks placed directly on the dirt floor. When the melt came, water pooled under his barn and soaked upward through capillary action. Hiram lost more than half his winter grain stores. His anger was vocal and sustained. He cursed the weather, the territory, the quality of his barn construction, and his own failure to anticipate the problem. Another neighbor, Levi Carmack, experienced similar losses. Levi had built his barn quickly the previous summer, prioritizing speed over foundation quality. The melt found every weakness in his construction. Water entered through gaps in the foundation, through poorly fitted door frames, through the joints where his roof met the walls. His stored wheat absorbed moisture and began sprouting inside the bags, ruining it for flour or animal feed. The pattern was consistent across the scattered homesteads. Men who had thought their structures adequate discovered that Dakota Territory winters operated by rules different from whatever regions they had come from. The cycle of heavy snow, followed by sudden thaw, created moisture problems that exceeded what simple log and stone construction could handle. Boone watched his neighbors struggle and calculated his own losses. He had been more fortunate than most, but fortune was not a strategy. He needed a solution that did not depend on mild winters or perfectly sealed buildings. That night, lying awake in his cabin while wind rattled the shutters, Boone began thinking about water and how it moved through soil and stone. Spring brought mud and the accounting of winter's costs. Boone sat at his rough-hewn table with a piece of charcoal and a flat board, making marks that represented calculations. He was not educated in formal mathematics, but he understood numbers in the practical way of men who must measure everything against survival. Each mark on the board represented a quantity: pounds of grain lost, hours spent shoveling snow, bags of feed damaged by moisture, days when weather prevented access to the barn. The grain loss alone was significant. 40 pounds of oats at St. Louis prices represented nearly a week's worth of hard labor during harvest. But the grain was only part of the cost. Boone counted the hours he had spent that winter maintaining a path between his cabin and barn. After every snowfall, he had shoveled a trail through drifts that sometimes reached his waist. The path required constant maintenance because wind filled it with new snow within hours of clearing. He estimated conservatively that he had spent 60 hours over the winter just keeping that single pathway open. The physical toll was harder to quantify but equally real. Moving supplies through deep snow and bitter cold was exhausting work. Carrying grain bags from barn to cabin meant trudging through drifts while trying to keep the bags dry. Hauling hay for the livestock required multiple trips because he could not carry large quantities through the snow. Feeding the animals during blizzards meant exposing himself to conditions that could kill a man caught too far from shelter. Every trip carried risk. Boone walked to Hiram Pogue's place that afternoon, ostensibly to borrow a saw, but actually to observe. Hiram was shoveling yet another path through late spring snow to reach his barn. The older man's face was red with effort. His breathing labored. Hiram was perhaps 50 years old, though frontier life made age difficult to estimate. The work was wearing him down. Boone could see it in the way Hiram moved, the careful placement of each shovelful, the frequent pauses to rest. They talked briefly about weather and planting schedules. Hiram complained about the late snow, about moisture damage to his seed grain, about the constant labor of winter maintenance. Boone listened and said little. He was forming an idea, but it was still too incomplete to share. Ideas that seemed logical in private thought often sounded foolish when spoken aloud, and Boone had learned to keep his own counsel until he was certain. That evening he stood in his barn and looked at the distance to his cabin, 40 feet, perhaps 45. The ground between was level, neither structure sitting significantly higher than the other. The soil was clay and gravel beneath the topsoil, good drainage characteristics based on how quickly spring melt disappeared. He paced the distance, counting steps, estimating depth requirements, thinking about stone and timber and the mechanics of moving earth. The idea was taking shape. It was absurd by conventional standards, more work than any reasonable man would consider, but Boone was beginning to understand that conventional approaches to frontier problems often led to conventional failures. Early June brought warmth and long days perfect for construction projects. Most homesteaders were focused on planting crops or repairing structures damaged by winter weather. Boone Halleck began digging a hole in the floor of his cabin beneath his sleeping platform. The platform was a simple frame structure raised 2 feet off the ground, providing storage space beneath and keeping his bedding away from the cold earth. Boone moved his stored supplies aside and started removing dirt. The work was harder than he had anticipated. The cabin floor had been packed hard by months of foot traffic and the weight of furniture. The first few inches required a pickaxe to break through the compacted surface. Below that, the soil was dense clay mixed with gravel. Boone worked methodically, removing dirt in small quantities, carrying it outside in a leather bucket, and dumping it in a low spot behind his cabin where he needed fill. Hiram Pogue stopped by on the third day of digging. He found Boone emerging from beneath the sleeping platform, covered in dirt, emptying another bucket of excavated soil. Hiram watched for a moment before speaking. His expression showed the kind of careful concern people use when addressing someone whose behavior seems questionable. He asked what Boone was doing. Boone said he was digging. Hiram could see that much. He asked why. Boone said he was planning a root cellar. The answer was not entirely false, but it was incomplete. Hiram looked skeptical but did not press the matter. He left shaking his head. The root cellar explanation satisfied most curious neighbors for the first 2 weeks. Root cellars were common enough on the frontier, though most were built as separate structures outside the cabin rather than underneath living quarters. Boone's approach seemed odd, but not entirely unreasonable. But as the digging continued into late June and then July, the scope of the project began to seem excessive for a simple storage cellar. Levy Carmack visited in mid-July and asked directly what Boone was building. By this point, Boone had excavated a shaft beneath his cabin that descended 6 feet below the floor level and was beginning to extend horizontally toward the barn. The quantity of removed earth was enormous, piled in a growing mound behind the cabin. Levy stood at the edge of the excavation and stared down into the hole where Boone was working by lantern light despite the bright afternoon sun above ground. Boone climbed out of the shaft and brushed dirt from his clothes. He told Levi he was digging a passage to his barn. The words sounded exactly as ridiculous spoken aloud as Boone had feared they would. Levi's face went through the several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, understanding, disbelief, and finally amusement. He asked why any man would dig a tunnel when he could simply walk across 40 feet of open ground. Boone explained about winter, snow, moisture damage, and constant labor. Levi listened, nodded slowly, and then started laughing. The laughter was not cruel, but it was genuine and sustained. Word spread quickly after that. Within a week, every homesteader within 10 miles knew that Boone Halleck was digging a tunnel from his cabin to his barn. Boone realized on a Tuesday morning in late July that simple digging would kill him. He was 8 feet down and beginning the horizontal section toward the barn when a section of the shaft wall collapsed. Not catastrophically, just a sliding failure of loose soil about 2 feet wide that dumped dirt into the area where he had been standing moments before. He had moved aside to adjust his lantern, pure chance saving him from being partially buried. He climbed out of the shaft and sat in the sunlight, breathing hard. understanding that luck was not a construction method. The problem was earth pressure. Vertical shafts were relatively stable because soil compressed downward under its own weight. Horizontal tunnels were different. The earth above wanted to fill the empty space below. Without support, the tunnel would collapse. Boone knew this intellectually, but seeing dirt fall into his excavation made the knowledge immediate and personal. He needed a method to hold back the earth while he worked and a permanent structure that would remain stable for years. He spent 3 days studying everything he could find about underground construction. His resources were limited to personal observation and conversation. There were no books on engineering in Dakota Territory, no experts to consult. But there were root cellars, storm shelters, and a played-out mine shaft 20 miles distant that some optimistic prospector had abandoned the previous year. Boone visited all of them, examining how other men had solved the problem of supporting earth. Root cellars used timber framing, heavy beams holding back the walls and ceiling. The technique worked, but required substantial wood and regular maintenance as timber rotted in the damp underground environment. Storm shelters used similar methods with the addition of sod roofs. The mine shaft was more instructive. The prospector had used timber initially, but had reinforced critical sections with stone walls. Where stone had been used, the structure remained solid. Where only timber existed, sections were beginning to sag and fail. Stone offered permanence that wood could not match. Stone did not rot, did not require replacement, and if properly fitted could bear enormous weight. But stone construction required skill Boone did not possess. He had built foundations and fireplaces using mortared stone, basic work that any competent homesteader could manage. Building a stone arch capable of supporting tons of earth was different. The forces were complex, the consequences of failure severe. Boone began experimenting with small-scale construction. He built test arches using rocks gathered from the creek, trying different configurations, learning how stones locked together. Most of his early attempts failed when he removed the temporary wooden supports. The stones shifted, found gaps, and collapsed. But gradually he learned to recognize which stone shapes were stable, how to position them so that weight forced them tighter together rather than pushing them apart, where the critical pressure points existed. The learning process was slow and frustrating, but Boone was patient. He could not afford to build his tunnel wrong. August brought heat that made underground work almost pleasant by comparison to surface labor. Boone stood in his excavation with a measuring stick, trying to determine how deep the tunnel needed to be. The decision involved multiple factors that sometimes conflicted with each other. Too shallow, and the tunnel would freeze in winter, potentially cracking the stone structure or creating frost heaves that would destabilize everything. Too deep, and he would hit groundwater, turning his passage into an underground stream. The correct depth existed somewhere between these extremes. Frost line was the first consideration. Boone had observed foundation construction and talked to men who had dug wells. The general consensus was that ground froze to a depth of approximately 4 feet in Dakota Territory winters. Some years the frost penetrated deeper, other years less, but 4 feet was the reliable estimate. To avoid frost damage, the tunnel needed to be below that depth with some safety margin. Boone decided on 6 feet as his target. 2 feet of safety buffer seemed reasonable. Water table was harder to determine. The creek near his property ran year-round, suggesting groundwater existed at some accessible depth. But surface water and groundwater were not the same thing. Boone dug several test holes at various locations between his cabin and barn, watching to see if water seeped in. At 6 feet depth, the holes remained dry even after several days. At 8 feet, one test hole began showing moisture accumulation, though not flowing water. The indications suggested that 6 feet was above the normal water table, though spring conditions might raise that level temporarily. Drainage became the third factor. Even if the tunnel stayed above the water table, moisture would still enter through the stone walls. Rain soaking into the ground above, condensation from temperature differences, occasional seepage during wet periods. All of this water needed somewhere to go. Boone's solution was to grade the tunnel floor slightly downward from the cabin end toward the barn. Water would flow along the floor and exit at the barn end, where he could manage it more easily. The grade did not need to be steep, just consistent. 2 inches over 40 feet would be sufficient. He began marking his intended tunnel route with stakes driven into the ground at 5-foot intervals. Each stake was marked at the 6-foot depth line. As he excavated, he would measure against these stakes to maintain consistent depth. The system was simple but effective. Boone had learned that complex projects required simple methods applied consistently. Trying to remember depths and angles without physical references led to errors that compounded as work progressed. The route was straight, the most direct line between cabin and barn. Some men might have considered angling the tunnel to avoid obstacles or follow easier digging, but Boone understood that every deviation from straight added length and complexity. 42 feet was manageable. 50 or 60 feet would require proportionally more stone, more excavation, more time. He had already committed to months of work. Adding unnecessary distance would extend that timeline indefinitely. The physical labor of removing 42 feet of earth from a tunnel 6 feet below ground level was transformative in ways Boone had not anticipated. His body changed shape over the weeks of digging, muscles in. His shoulders and back grew dense from swinging a pickaxe in confined spaces. His hands developed calluses on top of calluses, the skin becoming thick as boot leather. He lost weight despite eating more than usual, the work burning through calories faster than he could replace them. The process required brutal consistency. Each day Boone descended into the excavation and removed earth. He worked in sections, advancing the tunnel face by approximately 6 inches per day. The pace seemed glacial, but attempting to work faster led to sloppy excavation and unstable walls. He learned to read the soil as he dug, recognizing layers of clay that held together well and pockets of gravel that wanted to slide. Where the soil was stable, he could excavate larger sections. Where it was loose, he had to proceed more carefully. Temporary shoring prevented collapse while he worked. Boone constructed simple wooden frames using pine boards, bracing the tunnel walls and sealing every few feet as he advanced. The frames were crude but functional, holding back the earth just long enough for him to install permanent stone support. Once the stone arch was complete in a section, he could remove the wooden frames and reuse them for the next section. He had 4 frames that cycled through the tunnel in a constant rotation of placement, removal, and repositioning. Working underground in confined darkness tested Boone's mental endurance as much as his physical strength. The lantern provided only limited light, creating shadows that made distance and depth difficult to judge. The air was close and damp, smelling of earth and stone. Sounds were muffled and strange, the thud of his pickaxe seeming both too loud and too quiet simultaneously. Hours passed in a strange, timeless state, where he could not see the sun or feel wind or judge whether it was morning or afternoon without climbing to the surface. Disposal of excavated earth became a logistical challenge. Boone filled leather buckets with dirt and hauled them up a ladder to the surface. Each bucket held approximately 30 pounds. He estimated he removed between 40 and 50 buckets per day, meaning he was hauling over a ton of earth from underground to surface daily. The pile of dirt behind his cabin grew into a substantial mound. Neighbors riding past could see the evidence of his labor accumulating in a physical monument to obsessive effort. Hiram Pogu stopped by in mid-August and stood looking at the dirt pile. He asked how much earth Boone had removed. Boone estimated perhaps 15 tons so far, with another 10 to go. Hiram shook his head slowly, his expression mixing disbelief with something that might have been concern for Boone's sanity. He asked if Boone truly believed the tunnel was worth this much work. Boone said he would know next winter. September brought cooling temperatures and the urgent need to gather stone before ground froze. Boone had excavated perhaps two-thirds of the tunnel, and the sections he had completed stood as raw earth walls, waiting for their permanent stone lining. He needed hundreds of stones, possibly over 1,000 depending on final calculations. The stones needed to be specific sizes and shapes to function properly in arch construction. Random field stones would not suffice. Boone spent a week simply walking the creek beds and hillsides around his property, studying stones without moving any. He was learning to see stone the way a mason would, recognizing which shapes were useful and which were not. Rectangular stones with relatively flat surfaces were ideal for the tunnel walls where they would stack in regular courses. Wedge-shaped stones were essential for the arch, where they would lock together under compression. Irregular stones had minimal value except perhaps for foundation work or fill. The creek 200 yards from his cabin provided the best source. Water action over centuries had tumbled and shaped stones into useful configurations. Boone found flat pieces of limestone that had split along natural bedding planes, creating surfaces smooth enough to stack with minimal gaps. He found granite chunks with angular shapes perfect for arch construction. He found sandstone pieces that were softer and easier to shape, with a chisel when needed. Each stone he selected was examined from multiple angles, mentally fitted into the tunnel design before being accepted. Transportation was backbreaking. The stones Boone needed weighed between 20 and 60 pounds each, occasionally more for key structural pieces. He carried them from the creek to his cabin one at a time, sometimes two if they were smaller. The round trip took approximately 15 minutes. Carrying 40 stones per day, which was about all his body could manage, meant 10 hours of walking and hauling. His progress was measured in the growing pile of stones beside his cabin, stacked and sorted by type and size. Some stones required modification. Boone used a hammer and chisel to break off protruding edges or split larger stones into more useful shapes. The work required judgment and skill. Stone could split along hidden internal fractures in unexpected ways. A poorly placed chisel strike could ruin a good stone. Boone learned through waste and error, accepting that some stones would break wrong and becoming more skilled at reading the grain and structure to predict how they would fracture. By late September, he had accumulated enough stone to complete perhaps half the tunnel lining. The pile represented weeks of labor. Tons of rock carried piece by piece across 200 yards of uneven ground. Neighbors who saw the pile understood that Boone's commitment to his tunnel project went far beyond casual effort. This was obsession manifesting in physical form, the stubborn determination of a man who had decided on a course and would not be turned aside by labor or mockery or reasonable doubt. The stone arch was where theory met consequence. Boone understood the principle. Stones shaped like wedges, arranged in a curve, would lock together under the weight pressing down from above. Each stone would try to fall, but its wedge shape would jam it tighter against its neighbors, creating a structure that grew stronger under load. Roman aqueducts had used this principle for centuries. The challenge was translating ancient engineering into a Dakota Territory tunnel using stones gathered from a creek bed. Boone built wooden centering first, a temporary curved form that would support the arch stones during construction. He cut pine boards into curved ribs matching the arch radius he had calculated, approximately 3 feet from the tunnel floor to the apex of the curve. The centering rested on vertical posts positioned carefully on the tunnel floor. Once the arch stones were in place and locked together, he could remove the centering and the arch would support itself. Until that moment, the wooden form carried all the weight. Selecting stones for the arch required patience Boone had not known he possessed. Each stone needed to be wedge-shaped, with the narrow end pointing downward into the arch and the wide end forming the upper surface that would contact the earth above. Natural stones were rarely perfect wedges. Boone sorted through his pile repeatedly, holding stones against the wooden centering form, judging angles, occasionally using his chisel to improve a shape. The first stone he placed was at the base of the arch on one side, the springer stone that everything else would build from. He laid stones without mortar, a decision that had troubled him for weeks. Mortar was traditional in stone construction, but Boone had observed how mortar cracked in freezing temperatures. Dakota winters would freeze and thaw repeatedly, expanding and contracting any moisture trapped in mortar joints. The cracks would admit water, which would freeze and expand further, eventually destroying the mortar and destabilizing the arch. Dry stacked stone would flex slightly with temperature changes, the joints opening and closing microscopically without structural failure. The arch progressed stone by stone up both sides simultaneously. Boone worked methodically, placing a stone on the left side, then a matching stone at the same height on the right side, maintaining symmetry to keep forces balanced. Each stone was tested for stability, rocked gently to ensure it was seated properly against its neighbors. Gaps between stones were filled with smaller stone chips, driven in tightly to eliminate movement. The work was slow and demanded absolute attention. A poorly seated stone would create a weak point where the arch might fail under load. The keystone went in last, the final wedge at the apex of the arch that locked everything together. Boone had selected a piece of granite for this role, harder and denser than the limestone composing most of the arch. He shaped it carefully over 2 days, creating a wedge that would fit the remaining gap precisely. Installing it required forcing the stone into a space that seemed too small, driving it down with a wooden mallet while the entire arch creaked and settled around it. When the keystone seated fully, Boone felt the arch change. The structure became rigid, self-supporting, transferring the weight of earth above down through the curved stones and into the tunnel walls on both sides. With the arch complete and stable, Boone turned his attention to the vertical walls that would support it and contain the earth on both sides of the tunnel. The walls were equally critical to structural integrity. If they failed, the arch would lose its foundation and collapse. Boone approached wall construction with the same methodical care he had applied to every other aspect of the project, understanding that shortcuts taken now would manifest as failures later. The walls would be 2 stones thick, roughly 18 inches of solid rock between the tunnel interior and the surrounding earth. A single thickness wall might have been adequate structurally, but Boone wanted redundancy. If the outer layer developed cracks or allowed water penetration, the inner layer would provide backup. The double thickness also created better insulation, keeping the tunnel temperature more stable year-round. Cold was less of a concern than heat loss from his cabin above, but stable temperature would reduce condensation and ice formation. Foundation was first. Boone dug shallow trenches along both sides of the tunnel floor, perhaps 6 inches deep, and filled them with his largest, flattest stones. These foundation stones would carry the weight of everything above and distribute it across a wider area of tunnel floor. He selected granite pieces for this work, harder and less prone to cracking under sustained pressure than limestone or sandstone. The foundation layer took 3 days to complete, each stone carefully positioned and checked for level using a wooden straight edge and his eye. The wall courses went up in running bond pattern, each stone overlapping the joint between 2 stones in the course below. The pattern was instinctive to anyone who had ever built with stone, creating strength by ensuring that vertical joints never aligned. Weak points existed where stones met, and aligning those weak points vertically would create a failure plane where the wall could split apart. Staggered joints distributed stress and prevented splitting. Selecting wall stones was easier than selecting arch stones because the shapes required were simpler. Boone needed rectangular pieces with relatively flat tops and bottoms that would stack in stable courses. The creek had provided hundreds of suitable candidates. He worked from his sorted piles, choosing stones that were approximately the same height within each course to keep the wall rising evenly. Variations in stone size created character in the wall's appearance, but did not compromise strength as long. As each course was relatively level before the next course began, fitting was critical. Boone placed each stone carefully, testing how it sat against its neighbors, sometimes removing it and trying a different stone, occasionally using his chisel to knock off a protruding edge that prevented tight contact. The goal was to minimize gaps, creating a wall that was as close to solid stone as possible. Small gaps were inevitable and could be filled with stone chips, but large gaps indicated poor stone selection or placement. Boone rejected his own work frequently, pulling out stones that did not fit well and trying alternatives until satisfied. Water management influenced wall construction in subtle ways. Boone sloped the outer face of the wall very slightly outward, perhaps 1 inch over the wall's 4-foot height. The slope was barely visible, but would encourage any water seeping through the earth to run down the wall face rather than penetrating into the tunnel interior. October brought the challenge of connecting his tunnel to existing structures without compromising their integrity. Boone had excavated from his cabin toward the barn, advancing the tunnel face until it approached the barn's stone foundation. The final few feet of digging required extreme care because he was working directly beneath the barn floor, and any mistake could undermine the foundation and cause structural failure above. He exposed the barn foundation from below, revealing how the previous summer's construction had created the base for his building. The foundation was adequate for its original purpose, stacked fieldstone, mortared together, extending perhaps 2 feet below the barn's dirt floor. Boone studied it carefully, identifying which sections were load-bearing and which were simply fill. The barn's weight was concentrated on the corner foundations and along the wall lines. The center section, where Boone intended to create his tunnel exit, carried minimal structural load. Cutting through the foundation required removing stones one at a time from the interior face. Boone used a chisel and hammer to chip away the mortar holding stones together, working carefully to avoid jarring the structure above. Each stone he removed was examined to determine if its removal had weakened anything critical. Most came out without consequence, but occasionally he would find a stone that seemed to be carrying more weight than expected. Those stones he left in place and worked around, incorporating them into his tunnel exit design. The tunnel opening into the barn floor was positioned in the corner as planned, roughly 4 feet square, and lined with carefully fitted stones that transitioned from the tunnel's arched ceiling to the rectangular opening. Boone built stone steps rising from the tunnel floor up to barn level, each step a solid piece of limestone chosen for its flat surface and resistance to wear. The steps were steep but manageable, carrying supplies, rising 6 feet, over a horizontal distance of perhaps 8 feet. Sealing the connection between tunnel and barn foundation was critical. Gaps would allow water to enter and cold air to escape, defeating part of the tunnel's purpose. Boone used a mixture of clay and lime mortar to fill gaps between his new stonework and the existing foundation. The mortar was applied thick, pushed deep into joints, smoothing carefully to create a continuous seal. He knew the mortar would crack eventually in freezing temperatures, but by then the structure would be stable enough that minor cracks would not compromise overall integrity. A wooden hatch covered the tunnel entrance inside the barn. Boone built it from thick planks, heavy enough that animals could not accidentally push it open, but hinged to allow easy access. The hatch sat flush with the barn floor when closed, and Boone covered it with a thin layer of dirt and straw to make it visually continuous with the surrounding floor. Someone entering the barn would not immediately notice the entrance unless they knew where to look. Testing the connection meant walking from his cabin through the tunnel and emerging in the barn for the first time via the intended route rather than the temporary access he had been using during construction. The cabin end of the tunnel presented different challenges than the barn connection. Boone's living quarters sat directly above the tunnel entrance, and creating access required modifying the interior of his home without destroying its structural integrity or compromising warmth during winter. The entrance location beneath his sleeping platform was deliberate, chosen because the platform's support posts already transferred weight to the ground through specific points that Boone could work around. He had left the cabin end of the tunnel unfinished during the main excavation, maintaining temporary access through a wider opening that would eventually be reduced to final size. Now, with the tunnel substantially complete, he could refine the entrance to its intended configuration. The opening would be narrow, just wide enough for a man to descend comfortably, positioned in the corner where the sleeping platform met the cabin's rear wall. The location was inconspicuous, hidden behind stored supplies and beneath furniture. Stone steps descended from the cabin floor into the tunnel, mirroring the design he had used at the barn end, but oriented in the opposite direction. Boone carved these steps into the earth first, creating the basic form, then lined each step with flat limestone pieces mortared into place. The mortar here was less critical than at the barn connection because the cabin interior stayed relatively dry, but Boone used it anyway to prevent erosion and create durable surfaces that would withstand years of foot traffic. The entrance frame was built from heavy timber, posts and beams that would support the cabin floor above while leaving the opening clear. Boone had salvaged wood from a collapsed settler's cabin he had found abandoned 10 miles distant, old oak that had seasoned for years and was harder than fresh-cut pine. The oak posts were set into the tunnel floor on flat stone bases, extending up to contact the cabin floor joists. He notched the post carefully to create tight joints with the joists, then drove wooden pegs through the connections to lock everything together. A trapdoor similar to the barn hatch, but more refined, closed the entrance. The cabin door needed to be airtight to prevent heat loss during winter, so Boone built it with tongue and groove joints and sealed the edges with leather strips tacked around the frame. The door was heavy, requiring deliberate effort to lift, which prevented accidents while ensuring it would not blow open if wind somehow found its way into the tunnel. Leather hinges allowed the door to open smoothly while avoiding the metal that would conduct cold from below into the cabin. Boone tested the seal by lighting a candle and watching for drafts. Air movement would cause the flame to flicker or lean. He held the candle near the trapdoor edges, around the frame, anywhere cold air might penetrate. The flame burned steady and vertical. He adjusted the door fit slightly, adding another leather strip along one edge where he detected minimal air movement, then tested again. Satisfied, he proceeded to the final detail work that would make the entrance both functional and invisible to casual observation. When the sleeping platform was returned to its normal position, with stored supplies beneath, the trapdoor became just another piece of floor hidden in shadow. November arrived with cold winds that reminded Boone why he had spent 5 months digging through earth and hauling stone. The tunnel was structurally complete, but structural integrity was not the same as functional readiness. He spent the first week of the month testing every aspect of the system, identifying weaknesses, making final adjustments that would determine whether his work succeeded or failed when winter arrived in force. Water was the first test. Boone poured buckets of water into the tunnel at the cabin end, watching how it flowed along the floor toward the barn exit. The gradient he had engineered worked as intended. Water moved steadily downward, following the slight slope without pooling in low spots or finding unexpected paths through gaps in the stonework. He observed the flow pattern carefully, noting that water tended to follow the tunnel's center, where foot traffic had compressed the dirt floor slightly more than the edges. The observation suggested he should maintain that center channel clear of debris. He tested the structural integrity by applying force to the arch stones from inside the tunnel, pushing upward with a wooden pole braced against the floor. The arch did not move. The stones were locked together so tightly that individual pieces could not shift without displacing the entire structure. He examined the walls carefully in lamplight. looking for cracks, gaps, or signs of settling. The stonework showed minor imperfections, but no structural concerns. Some joints had opened slightly as the surrounding earth settled against the walls, but the gaps were hairline fractures that did not compromise strength. Ventilation required attention. The tunnel was essentially sealed at both ends by trapdoors, creating a confined space where air could become stale or, more dangerously, fill with gases from the earth. Boone drilled small holes through both trapdoors, perhaps half an inch in diameter, positioned high on the doors where they would allow air circulation without creating significant heat loss. The holes were small enough that they would not admit mice or insects, but large enough to prevent suffocation if someone was trapped in the tunnel. He practiced moving supplies through the tunnel, timing himself and evaluating the efficiency compared to surface travel. Carrying a 50-pound grain sack from cabin to barn through the tunnel took approximately 3 minutes, including descent, transit, and ascent. The same trip across the surface in good weather took perhaps 1 minute. The tunnel was slower under ideal conditions, but ideal conditions existed only part of the year. Boone was building for the other conditions, for snow and ice and blizzards that would make surface travel impossible or dangerous. The entrance points received final refinements. Boone smoothed the stone steps, removing rough edges that might catch boot heels or cause stumbling in darkness. He oiled the trapdoor hinges with bear fat to ensure they would open smoothly even in freezing temperatures. He positioned lanterns at both tunnel ends, kept filled with oil and ready for immediate use. Quick access to light would be essential when entering the tunnel during emergencies or night conditions. The first significant snow fell on November 18th, a heavy wet storm that dropped 8 inches overnight and continued through the following day. Boone woke to the familiar sound of wind driving snow against his cabin walls. He dressed, started his fire, and prepared his morning coffee while watching through his window as the landscape transformed from brown earth to uniform white. By mid-morning, the snow was deep enough that walking through it required high steps and conscious effort. Boone needed to feed his livestock. The cows required hay and grain, and water would need to be hauled from the creek unless he wanted to melt snow, which was inefficient and time-consuming. Under normal circumstances, this would mean bundling in heavy coats, shoveling a path to the barn, making multiple trips carrying supplies while snow soaked through wool and leather, and returning exhausted and cold. Instead, Boone lifted the trapdoor beneath his sleeping platform and descended into his tunnel. The temperature difference was immediately noticeable. The surface air was well below, freezing probably in the low 20s based on how quickly his breath condensed. The tunnel was cold but stable, perhaps 40 degrees, the Earth's natural insulation moderating the temperature extremes. Boone carried his lantern and a grain sack. The walk through the tunnel took less than 2 minutes at a steady pace. His boots stayed dry. His clothes remained unwet by snow. He emerged in his barn, feeling no colder than when he had departed his cabin. The cows shifted in their stalls, recognizing his presence. Boone fed them grain and hay, checked their water, and made mental notes about supply levels. He would need to haul more hay from his storage stack before the next storm. That task could also be accomplished through the tunnel, though hay bales were bulky and would require effort to maneuver through the confined space. Still, difficult was better than impossible, which was what moving hay became when snow drifted 4 feet deep. He returned to his cabin, secured the barn, trapdoor, and retraced his path through the tunnel. The entire feeding operation had taken perhaps 20 minutes. No snow removal, no wet clothes to dry, no cold seeping through inadequate winter gear to chill him for hours afterward. Boone sat at his table drinking coffee and looking out at the storm with a satisfaction that had nothing to do with smugness and everything to do with validation. The tunnel worked exactly as he had intended. Over the next 3 days, the storm continued intermittently, adding another 6 inches of accumulation. Boone watched from his window as Hiram Pogue struggled to maintain a path to his barn. Hiram shoveled twice daily, creating a narrow trench through deepening snow. Each shoveling session took approximately an hour of hard labor. Boone made 6 trips through his tunnel during those same 3 days, feeding animals and checking supplies. Total time spent on these tasks was perhaps 2 hours across all 6 trips. The efficiency was dramatic and undeniable. December brought the storm that justified everything. The blizzard arrived on the 9th, with winds that bent trees and drove snow horizontally across the landscape. Visibility dropped to arm's length. Temperatures plunged to near zero, and the wind chill made exposed skin dangerous within minutes. The storm was the kind that killed unprepared travelers and trapped homesteaders in their cabins for days. Boone had experienced similar storms during his years in Dakota Territory, and understood their power and danger. The wind was too strong to allow safe travel between buildings. Boone could not see his barn from his cabin window, though it was only 40 feet distant. The space between was filled with driving snow and wind that would knock a man down and disorient him completely. Stories circulated among frontier settlers about men who froze to death 10 yards from their cabin doors because they became confused in blizzard conditions and walked the wrong direction. Boone had no intention of becoming one of those stories. He descended into his tunnel and made his way to the barn through still air and steady temperature. The contrast was extraordinary. Above ground, nature was demonstrating lethal force. Below ground, Boone walked calmly through stone-lined passage, his lantern burning steady, his breathing easy. He fed his livestock, checked that the barn structure was holding against the wind, and returned to his cabin. The round trip took 15 minutes. He repeated the journey twice more that day, maintaining his animals' feeding schedule without exposing himself to conditions that could kill. The blizzard continued for 3 days. Snow accumulated to depths that made measurement difficult because wind created drifts that varied from bare ground to 6-foot piles. Boone's tunnel exits at both cabin and barn were protected from direct wind by the buildings above, so snow did not drift into the openings significantly. He cleared minor accumulation with few shovel strokes each time he used the exits, work that took seconds, rather than the hours required to maintain a surface path. On the 2nd day of the storm, Boone noticed something unexpected. The tunnel was actually warmer than it had been during the earlier November snow. The reason became clear after consideration. The heavy snow above was acting as additional insulation, trapping Earth's heat and preventing cold air from penetrating downward. The snow layer, combined with 6 feet of earth, created an insulating barrier that maintained stable temperature regardless of surface conditions. The tunnel was becoming more effective as winter worsened, the opposite of every other frontier structure that became harder to manage as conditions deteriorated. By the 3rd day, Boone had settled into a routine that felt almost normal. He woke, started his fire, ate breakfast, descended to feed animals, returned, worked on indoor projects, descended again for evening feeding, returned for supper and sleep. The blizzard was inconvenient because it confined him to his cabin and barn, but it was not dangerous. He had food, warmth, and secure shelter. His livestock were fed and protected. The situation was manageable because his tunnel eliminated the most dangerous variable, forced exposure to lethal weather. The blizzard ended on December 12th, leaving behind a transformed landscape. Snow had drifted against buildings and filled low areas with depths that made normal movement impossible. The sky cleared to brilliant blue, and temperatures remained brutally cold. Settlers emerged from their cabins to assess damage and begin the work of digging out. Boone stood outside his cabin looking at the undisturbed snow between his door and his barn. No path existed because no path had been needed. Hiram Pogue arrived on the 14th, 2 days after the storm ended. He had spent those days shoveling paths, checking his livestock, and repairing a section of his barn roof that had partially collapsed under snow weight. He looked exhausted, his face wind-burned and lined with the kind of fatigue that came from sustained physical hardship. He found Boone splitting firewood outside his cabin, working steadily but showing none of the exhaustion that marked other settlers who had survived the blizzard. Hiram commented that Boone looked well-rested for a man who had just endured 3 days of blizzard. Boone acknowledged this was true. Hiram looked at the snow between cabin and barn, noting its undisturbed surface, then looked at Boone's barn, where tracks in the snow indicated the door had been opened recently from inside. He asked directly how Boone had fed his animals during the storm. Boone set down his axe and told Hiram to come inside. Inside the cabin, Boone lifted the trapdoor beneath his sleeping platform. Hiram stared down into the opening, seeing stone steps descending into lamplight. His expression moved through several stages: confusion, understanding, and something approaching disbelief. He asked to see it. Boone lit a lantern and led him down into the tunnel. They walked the 42 feet from cabin to barn, Hiram running his hand along the stone walls, examining the arch overhead, testing his footing on the floor. When they emerged in the barn, Hiram stood silent for a long moment. The walk back to the cabin was equally quiet. They climbed out into Boone's living quarters, and Hiram sat heavily on a bench. He asked how long the construction had taken. Boone said 5 months of steady work. Hiram asked about the stone, the excavation, the engineering. Boone answered each question factually, describing techniques and decisions without embellishment. Hiram listened with the attention of a man reassessing previous judgments. Before leaving, Hiram asked if Boone had lost any supplies to moisture damage during the blizzard. Boone showed him the grain storage, opening bins to reveal perfectly dry oats and corn. Hiram's own grain. Supplies had suffered. Snow had blown through gaps in his barn walls, melted from animal body heat, and created moisture that was already causing spoilage. He was facing the prospect of reduced winter feed and possible livestock losses if the winter continued severe. Boone's supplies were pristine. Word spread without Boone saying anything. Hiram mentioned the tunnel to Levi Carmack, who mentioned it to others. Within a week, most homesteaders within 10 miles knew that Boone Halleck had built an underground passage and had weathered the blizzard without difficulty, while everyone else struggled. January brought a steady stream of visitors. Men who had previously mocked Boone's project now appeared at his cabin asking questions. Some were openly curious, wanting to understand the engineering. Others were more cautious, their pride wounded by the obvious success of something they had dismissed as foolish. Boone received them all with the same quiet courtesy, answering questions and showing anyone interested the tunnel itself. Levi Carmack arrived in mid-January with specific questions about stone selection and arch construction. Levi had decided to build a root cellar using similar techniques, and he wanted to understand the principles before beginning excavation. Boone spent an afternoon explaining how wedge-shaped stones lock together under compression, how to calculate arch radius based on available materials, and how to grade floors for drainage. Levi took notes using charcoal on pieces of bark, sketching details he wanted to remember. A homesteader named Ransom Coker rode 15 miles specifically to see the tunnel. Ransom was planning to build a new barn the following summer and was considering whether to include underground access from his cabin. He asked detailed questions about cost in labor and materials, trying to determine if the investment was worthwhile for his situation. Boone was honest about the work required. 5 months of sustained effort was not trivial, and a man needed to evaluate whether the benefits justified that cost. For Boone, the answer was clearly yes. For others, the calculation might differ. Hiram Pogue returned in late January with an unexpected request. He wanted to build a tunnel connecting his cabin to his barn and asked if Boone would advise on the project. Hiram was willing to pay for consultation in the form of labor exchange or goods. Boone declined payment, but agreed to help. They spent several days that winter at Hiram's property, surveying the route, discussing depth and drainage, planning the excavation sequence. Hiram's soil conditions were different from Boone's, more sand and less clay, which would affect construction techniques. Boone explained how to adjust methods for different soil types. The questions people asked revealed what mattered most to frontier settlers. How much stone was required and where could it be found? How deep to dig to avoid frost while staying above water? How to prevent collapse during excavation? How to build arches without formal training? How to integrate tunnel exits into existing structures? Boone answered from experience, describing not just what worked, but what he had tried that failed. The failures were often more instructive than the successes. Some visitors came simply to see something unusual. The tunnel was becoming known across the territory as Halleck's Passage, a curiosity that demonstrated what obsessive determination could accomplish. These visitors were less interested in construction details and more interested in the spectacle of a man walking underground between buildings. Boone tolerated their curiosity politely, but focused his attention on people who came with serious intent to learn. Those were the ones who might build something similar and benefit from the knowledge he had gained through months of difficult work. Spring of 1843 brought evidence that ideas, once proven useful, spread organically through communities that valued practical solutions. Hiram Pogue began excavating his tunnel in April, applying techniques Boone had shared with modifications suited to his specific conditions. Levi Carmack completed a stone-lined root cellar using arch construction principles adapted from Boone's tunnel design. 3 other homesteaders within 20 miles started similar projects, each customized to their needs but following the same basic engineering concepts. Boone watched these developments with quiet satisfaction. He had not set out to revolutionize frontier construction methods, only to solve a personal problem that threatened his supplies and livestock. But good solutions to common problems did not remain isolated. Men talked, shared information, adapted ideas to their circumstances. The tunnel concept was spreading because it worked, because it addressed difficulties that affected everyone living through Dakota Territory winters, and because the engineering was simple enough that competent builders could replicate it without formal training. His own tunnel continued functioning exactly as designed. The second winter proved even more demanding than the first, with a particularly brutal February that brought sustained cold and repeated storms. Boone moved between cabin and barn dozens of times during those weeks, always dry, always protected from wind and snow, always confident that his supplies and animals were accessible regardless of surface conditions. The tunnel became simply part of his infrastructure, as fundamental as his fireplace or his well. Years later, travelers moving through the region reported finding abandoned homesteads with stone-lined tunnels connecting buildings. Some were well constructed and still functional decades after their builders had moved on. Others showed evidence of ambitious attempts that were never completed or were poorly executed and had collapsed. The variations illustrated an important truth about frontier innovation. The idea was only part of the solution. Execution mattered equally, and execution required knowledge, skill, patience, and sustained effort. Boone himself remained in Dakota Territory until 1849, when changing circumstances drew him westward toward Oregon. He sold his property to a family newly arrived from Pennsylvania. The husband examined the tunnel carefully, walking its length multiple times, running his hands over the stonework, asking detailed questions about maintenance and durability. Boone explained what little maintenance was required: occasional clearing of debris from the floor, annual inspection for any stones that might have shifted, monitoring the drainage to ensure water continued flowing properly. The work was minimal compared to the benefit provided. The tunnel Boone Halleck built in 1842 remained structurally sound into the 1880s, long after Boone himself had left the territory. It sheltered multiple families, protected countless supply movements, and stood as physical evidence that individual determination combined with practical engineering could overcome environmental challenges that seemed insurmountable. The neighbors, who had laughed when he started digging, had long since recognized their error. Some had built their own versions. Others had simply acknowledged that Boone had seen a problem clearly and solved it completely, while they had remained trapped in conventional thinking that accepted hardship as inevitable. The stone arch he built underground outlasted the wooden buildings it connected, testimony to the permanence of solutions designed with care and executed with uncompromising attention to what actually worked rather than what was easy or traditional.